Isn't it?
Okay, excellent. Well, without keeping you waiting any longer, let me say good morning. Good morning to all of our listeners listening from Colombo. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are listening. If you're like me, if you're joining from California, good evening. Today we have a very special seminar with us. Uh, and for that, we are joined with Nilanthan Niruthan, who is a defense analyst and a well-known figure in the defense circles in Colombo. Nilanthan is a regular speaker in the Colombo Security Dialogue, the Gaul Defense Dialogue, and usually, very good with brushing shoulders with big shot military generals from Sri Lanka and the South Asia and with the world alike. So, Nilanthan and I've understood that, and we've worked together briefly when I was with BCIS, the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. And Nilanthan is a research fellow. That's how I know him. And he doesn't, he is a very straight talker, a very sharp security mind who's joined with us. And thank you, Nilanthan, for taking the time. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, yes. Thanks for being here. So Nilanthan, how is Colombo? How is the situation there?
Colombo could be better. The Western province is under complete lockdown for the next 3 days. So while we did enjoy a spate in the middle where we were all having a little too much fun, I guess, we're all back into lockdown mode now.
Okay. Well, that's good and bad. I suppose the good things are we get to do more webinars, keep people, more engaged. So getting to business. So the topic today is, Sri Lanka's choices in a more chaotic world and a lot of geopolitics and security coming about. Of course, our objective today is to get a broader understanding of, global security events and how they affect Sri Lanka in general. So, without taking any more time and without keeping our audience waiting, let me ask, so Nilanthan, I was listening to a talk you gave at the Colombo Defense Seminar last year in 2019, where you say that politics in the Indian Ocean will have a huge impact on South Asian security calculations, and and that um, and that the power game in the Indian Ocean is bigger than South Asia itself, that it affects the entire world. I'm just curious, what do you mean by this? Can you elaborate by that? What do you mean that by that?
Okay, sure. So what I meant by that was that the Indian Ocean power game and the South Asian power game, while interconnected, are not necessarily the same thing. So South Asia generally refers to the Indian Peninsula and a couple of countries around it, right? So you would have sort of Myanmar and stuff on this side. You would have Pakistan, Afghanistan on that. So it spans about 7, 8, 9 countries because different people sort of have different definitions for how they look at South Asia. The Indian Ocean, on the other hand, is a much bigger region. Now, for people in countries like Sri Lanka, for example, it's very important for us to understand that these are two different games, so to speak, that we are caught up in, right? Even though I'm not a big fan of using cliches about us being trapped between two giants and all of that sort of narrative nonsense, it is
Mm-hmm.
true that we have to navigate through a geopolitical minefield. And it is
Mm-hmm.
true that there's a South Asian race going on and there's an Indian Ocean race going on, right? The Indian Ocean essentially combines both South Asian politics and Southeast Asian politics, right? If you want to look at East Asia as a separate entity, then you could add that into this calculation as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
as far as global power politics go, the Indian Ocean, as I'm sure you and your audience knows, sort of is in terms of natural resources, a very important region. In terms of trade, facilitating trade, one of the most important routes in the world. In terms of energy supply and things like that, that's a vital part. And in terms of power projection, military,
Mm-hmm.
just old-fashioned power projection, the Indian Ocean is extremely important as well, right? So what I meant by that was that we must always understand the players involved in each game. Sometimes the players are the same. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, we know that India and China to partners or allies or rivals, however you want to look at it based on your political views. We know that they will have a huge influence on how things go, whether it's South Asian politics or Indian Ocean politics. But if you look at Indian Ocean politics as a whole, you would look at countries like Japan, like maybe even Australia and the United States. There are many other players involved as well. And the destiny of South Asia and the destiny of the Indian Ocean will be intertwined, but we must understand both as different frameworks, was my point.
I think that's a good introduction. Can you tell us if anything has changed in the last 5 or last 10 years? I mean, people say that China, the rise of China has been a disruption to the existing balance of power, the geopolitics in the region. But then again, it's not just China. India has been rising, flexing India's muscles. And from our discussions long ago, I remember you saying that, Prime Minister Modi has had a very different engagement strategy with India's borders in South Asia, but also with China. Has anything changed in the last 5 years that makes intensifies the geopolitical struggle in the region, or is it still the same? I mean, just bluffing.
So I would say the big difference that we've seen in the world is a cultural change that we've seen in the sense of people now in many geopolitically significant parts of the world wanting to go towards more sort of nationalist, state leading ideologies and parties. But in terms of the overall calculations, no, it's more or less proceeded on predictable lines, right? 10 years ago, people predicted that China's rise would be sort of would lead to more friction with the United States. That turned out to be true. That it would lead to more friction with India. That turned out to be true. That many of these countries would gather up to sort of consolidate against China, like the Quad, for example. That turned out to be true. The big difference has been in political sort of allegiance. Because, I mean, just 6 years ago, think of what the world was like 6 years ago, right? Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister of India, and many pundits dismissed the idea of someone like Narendra Modi becoming a Prime Minister as some kind of right-wing fantasy. Barack Obama was still the president in the United States, and all the pundits and intellectuals dismissed the possibility of someone like Trump coming to power. You have the United Kingdom was still, Britain was still a part of the European Union, and all the pundits and intellectuals completely dismissed the idea that there would ever be a referendum where the people would vote with supposed fascists like Nigel Farage, but they clearly did, because he's not a fascist, right? And so culturally, in terms of just last year, look at the Australian elections where all the pundits and intellectuals said Scott Morrison was done, that he was finished, and Scott Morrison ended up winning, right? So that has been the cultural change, the shift, the growing rift rather between the intellectual class and day-to-day ordinary citizens. That gap has never been wider than it is today, and that is the major thing. But in terms of the behavior of these states, I wouldn't say a lot has changed geopolitically, no.
Interesting. Before we go any further, I want to let the audience know that if you have any questions, feel free to comment on our video below. We will take them up as we have our discussion. So coming back to our discussion, very heated discussion, Nilan. So you mentioned that, about the intellectuals and, a lot of pundits not predicting what would have happened, and unfortunately, things didn't go that way. Do you see a reversal of the trends, maybe with the upcoming U.S. presidential election, if former Vice President Joe Biden wins the presidency? Do you think that trend might be a little bit, reversed, and hopefully the right-wing nationalists and the conservatives, the trend that, the Trumpism trend that sort of went across the world with Narendra Modi and the UK, do you think that might go back to things being normal, or we might never go back to things being normal?
I don't see how they would go back, because the underlying factors that led to those uh, that led to that situation is still completely unaddressed, right?
Mhm.
And even, I mean, even look, who knows? Maybe we would find out in November that this is yet another in a series of long cases where the pollsters and the pundits assured us that one candidate had no chance, and it turned out that that candidate had a very good chance. Who knows? It could be that way. I mean, in fact, other than the polling data, I would say nothing really looks good for Joe Biden. You know,
Mhm.
in terms of even just instinctively, right? I mean, it's true that a majority of the Democrats are worried about the pandemic, while many Republicans are not. But when you see Trump pulling 5,000 people to a rally and Joe Biden pulling about 10 people, right? And Joe Biden speaking in front of 10 people, right? While Trump is speaking in front of a stadium packed with 5, 6, 7,000 people.
Mhm.
You look at the cable TV ratings, for example. Just last week, it came out that Tucker Carlson, for the last 3 months, has been the highest watched cable news personality in television history, right?
Mhm.
So other than the polling numbers, which we know were wrong in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in India, even in, and people say, oh no, the polling numbers were not wrong. It's the interpretation of the polling that was wrong. Well, maybe the interpretation of the polling is wrong this time, but other than that one unreliable metric, none of
Mhm.
the other numbers really look good for Joe Biden. So look, maybe all these Silicon Valley media companies are right, and maybe Biden is going to win by a landslide. Maybe I saw some poll that said Biden was leading Trump by like 17 points in a place like Wisconsin or something like that, right? Where just but when you look at Trump speak in Wisconsin and Joe Biden speaking in Wisconsin, where one guy is in front of a huge crowd and the other
Mhm.
guy is in front of 15 people, it's a
Mhm.
little hard to buy the polls that Biden is 17 or 20 points ahead based on what you see with the eyes. But with all that being said, no, I don't see this global trend being reversed because of one incident or one sort of blemish in the record. Because what
Mhm.
we're seeing is countries that are not geopolitically significant
Mhm.
have been able to avoid this. So if you look at Canada, if you look at New Zealand, right? I mean, both the Canadian head of state and the New Zealand head of state are kind of worshipped almost as rock stars in the sort of Twitterati intellectual space, right? It's almost like the second coming of Jesus when you hear people talk about these guys. But these are not, but at the same time, if you look at
Mhm.
Canada and the United States has Trump, and if you look at New Zealand and Australia, where Australia is the biggest senior partner there, Australia would have someone like Scott Morrison. So as far as the countries which call the shots in the world go, I don't
Mhm.
see this trend being reversed.
Okay, interesting, interesting. I think that's that's like a conversation for a whole day. We can discuss and debate, audiences, whether the media
Yeah.
theatrics and whether people are really coming during a pandemic time to Joe Biden's campaign. So anyway, let's bring the discussion towards South Asia, towards home. So a few days ago, I think this was even not even this hasn't been even a week. So a few days ago, the US Secretary of State and the US Secretary of Defense came to India. And, this is about a week before a presidential election is, happening and the results are coming out. And they signed an important security agreement with India. What's the timing of this? What's the significance of this? And let me combine a second question into this. Can you tell us what the quad is? Like 4 years, 5 years ago, I haven't heard of the quad, and now it's like a common word that we hear in security circles. Over to you.
Okay, so which question would you like me to answer first? Because there's a way in which we can segue from one into the other for both. So
Up to
which
you.
question do you want me to tackle first?
It's up to you.
Okay, so maybe let's just go with the idea of the quad first, right? Because it's a much bigger idea. So the quad essentially stands for quadrilateral defense, blah, 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 right? None of these things actually have names that lay people, it's again one of those ivory tower intellectual things. But the quad is essentially a strategic forum that consists of India, the United States, Australia, and Japan. And this was Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan at that time in 2007. It was his brainchild because he felt that there needed to be a sort of league of democracies, so to speak, that could stand up against the rise of China, right? So every year they conduct something called the Malabar exercises. The Malabar exercises are naval exercises. Malabar is a place in the South Indian state of Kerala, right? So or near the Malabar coast is where they have these naval exercises. The reason this has become huge now is threefold. The first is clearly the pandemic, which the sort of many of China's adversaries have been very badly affected by the pandemic, like the USA and India, for example. So they feel that China must be held to account for this. And of course, they stand to geopolitically benefit as well, right? If your rival gets undermined, then common sense dictates that you benefit from that in some way as well. So that's one. The second is this growing friendship between many of these, like what we were just discussing, right-wing leaders, right? I mean, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Scott Morrison, right? If you look at other parts of the world, Boris Johnson, right? This is the closest we now have to the whatever 1950 version of whatever Churchill and Roosevelt and blah, 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 of leaders who actually had public friendships with other heads of state. And these friendships then formed a big part of their global policy, right? Because these are all very personality-driven leaders in that sense. So that's the Quad. The Quad is a security forum, an unofficial entity of these four countries. 2020 is and this is why this is the third reason why it's important. 2020 will be the first time that all four countries conduct military exercises in the Malabar region. So India has invited Australia this year, and it will be the first time that all four. So China has always been making noise about the Quad, and they've always said this is outrageous, this is unacceptable, blah, 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 right? But 2020 is a very significant year. They're supposed to, it's scheduled to happen next month in November, and it will be the first time that all four countries of the Quad indulge in naval operations together. Now, in terms of the treaty, in terms of the agreement that they signed, so that now leads us from where we left off with the Quad. So the major purpose of this agreement between India and the United States is intelligence sharing. In terms of combating China in a conventional battlefield, India has a huge advantage in terms of doctrine and experience, right? India has a tremendous amount of experience fighting wars. China has zero. India has a tremendous amount of doctrine in terms of fighting wars. China has doctrine, but none of them are actual doctrine that have been tested out in battle, right? I mean, there's a reason. Yeah, you were going to say something?
Yeah, when you mean experience, can you list down a few experiences that India has and that China doesn't? One could argue that.
Sure. So India has faced a number of military campaigns, has had to undertake a number of military campaigns. There have been 1947, 1956, 1971 conventional wars against Pakistan. There's been the 1999 unconventional war in Kargil. India has been involved in peacekeeping operations in some parts, including in our own country. In terms of counter-insurgency, dealing with the Naxalite problem, dealing with the Khalistan insurgency, India has actually had success in terms of dealing with armed threats. Right? While China, on the other hand, has no experience. There's a reason why when you look at Chinese scholars, Chinese generals, Chinese intellectuals, they still quote Sun Tzu. They still quote The Art of War, right? In the last 50 years, they've not really been involved in any major military campaign for them to have doctrine, for them to have experience. So the one advantage China has over India is obviously in terms of technology, right? So this agreement is meant to help India neutralize that advantage in some way. When I say if there's an intelligence sharing agreement, This is not really an intelligence sharing agreement in the sense that your intelligence services call up their intelligence services and say, there's a terrorist running around there, this is his name. No. This is
Right.
intelligence in terms of military technology. This
And this is
is
recent agreement signed with India and China.
the one that they just signed. This is intelligence sharing in terms of satellite imagery. So, for example, let's say you have an automated missile system, an automated weapon system. Now,
Mm.
when you fire that missile, that weapon system has to use some kind of satellite imagery to navigate. So with this agreement now, the Indian missiles can use US satellite imagery and US data for
Mm.
navigation and things
Mm.
like that. So
Mm.
that is the major significance of this. The Indian government, starting from this year, has really tried to bring in the private sector into the defense industry. And on the American side, there have been a lot of initiatives to start creating US India partnerships in terms of defense and
Mm.
weapons manufacturing. So this
Mhm.
will essentially be the first step in that direction, and it's a very significant step in that direction, because now this also makes the United States a very, very favorable partner in terms of the purchase of weapons, because your satellite imagery, the intelligence that you use for your weapons are already integrated with theirs. So in terms of things like that, this agreement will fuel India-US partnership in terms of security and weapons manufacturing and things like that.
So, if I can play the devil's advocate a little bit here, I can think of a few problems where, that agreement might, at least in the early phases, face some problems. And I know you've written a little bit on, Indian space capabilities, and that's, as you mentioned before, that it's where the next fight is, geopolitical struggle is going to be. So, and for once, I can think of problems trying to connect India's technology, India's hardware with, America's software or the intelligence that might initially run into problems, where they might not seamlessly work. And I suppose my second question is, India already seems to have a fairly okay space infrastructure, some satellites and intelligence. What's America adding on to India's already, capable capacity there?
So in terms of what they would add, what they're essentially adding is, as I was saying, the ability to collect information. When these projectiles and these missiles have to operate on their own version of the world, they have a virtual map, a satellite map, digital map, however you want to envision it, to navigate across. It's very important that they be accurate, and it's very important that they be accurate right down to the last minute detail, because we're dealing with sometimes maybe aerial engagements where microseconds count. And in terms of your first sort of point of, there will be issues, you're right that there will be issues, but these are issues that all countries will face when they go into these sort of ventures together. The US India venture in this direction will not bring any unique problems. All it will bring are the same regular problems that any two countries will face when they try to integrate their defense sort of equipment together. I mean, you can look at the United States and Israel, for example, where initially there was a lot of integration problems, but now they're real. I mean, of course, now Israel is the one manufacturing, and the US have to kind of buy from them, right? So the situation has kind of been reversed there. But these are normal problems. These are not unique problems that are faced by, but that will be faced by either Trump or Modi or Biden or Modi or whoever we're talking about.
Let me ask a somewhat controversial question, I suppose. When you look at, the world from India's perspective, Sri Lanka is right, in India's security, security bubble, security paradigm. Does Sri Lanka fall under, maybe, I mean, if India does have, anti-missile security, anti-defense technologies, does that mean Sri Lanka is also covered free of charge, or is that a contentious issue right now, or is it not?
In terms of what? If you could give me a specific on what you mean, I could give you a more concrete answer.
Right. I suppose this should really go on to like a larger question, like, in this, and if you look at South Asia's neighborhood, in like a crowded neighborhood, Where do you think the interests of the Cod and other parties coming in? I suppose I'm curious, is Sri Lankan Navy participating in the Malabar exercises for once? And can you, and if you know, there's a lot of navies and a lot of militaries in the South Asian neighborhood, is there enough space for all these militaries to go around without, you know, any agreement or understanding of each other?
So that's essentially how most navies have functioned throughout human history. So I don't see why that would now be a problem. We've got to also remember that the world that we're living in is a very modern world in that sense, right? All of these norms have only been in place for the last 50 or 60 years, and the world has been functioning for thousands of years before that. So I don't see any major changes happening in that regard. But of course, both India and China consider us to be in their sphere of interest. So that is a reality that we will have to face. And to be honest, it should not come as a surprise to anybody. It should, at this point, all Sri Lankans must know that it is common sense for each one of us to kind of realize that the world we live in is a very large place and we occupy a pretty geographically small space in it. And sort of whatever decisions we take will have an impact on other people playing political chess with each other, other states, I mean.
I like the term political chess. For our audience, I want to emphasize, if you have any questions, please don't feel shy to write it as a comment so we can take it up right now live. Here's a broad question for you. I suppose this is something we've also had a time to discuss. So is there such a thing as, you know, like a US-China emerging Cold War? Do you agree with Graham Allison's the famous foreign policy author, the former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, I think the founding dean, of his characterization that, you know, of that the U.S. and China are destined to conflict? What's your characterization, or is it just a myth? You know, our discussion today is about myth busting.
Yeah, so he calls it the Thucydides trap, right? He refers to it as the Thucydides trap, which is essentially based on Rome and Carthage, if I'm not mistaken. I can't recall which dichotomy he used. But the basic thesis is that when two empires become so powerful, at some point one will end up destroying the other, right? And you could go back to kind of even Chinese proverbs, because as I was saying, Chinese generals and intellectuals love quoting ancient Chinese
Greece,
proverbs.
not Rome, sorry.
Sorry?
It's Greece and the Spartans. This is
Oh,
before.
exactly. Sort of Athens and Sparta, right?
And Athens and
Was
Sparta,
the,
yeah.
yeah, and they had the Melian dialogue and stuff like that. I mean, I should
Exactly.
remember that I teach this kind of stuff, so I should remember that. Anyway, so
Same here. I should have remembered. Okay.
I will, I'm just mortal after all, right? So ultimately, so even with the sort of Chinese take on it, even you'll find them often spouting things like you can only have one lion in a mountain, blah blah blah, right? So they subscribe to this as well. My only problem with the use of the term Cold War is that it is an extremely misleading way to characterize what we see between the United States and China, because I see many experts, I see many academics and intellectuals. You can YouTube this, right? Just YouTube USA China Cold War, and you will get a dozen discussions on this. But not in a single one of these discussions do any of these global experts even speak about whether the terminology of a Cold War would be appropriate for this. So just as how the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans was very different from the world wars that came before it, whatever we will see between China and the United States will be significantly different from the Cold War. It will be as different from the Cold War as the Cold War was from the previous world wars. In fact, you could say that history, if at all we recognize a war between the United States and China, history will see it as already having been started. right? They would probably look at the trade war, or they would go back 10 years where the real cyber warfare between United States and China started, where Chinese hackers attack American businesses and American hackers attack Chinese businesses, right? If at all this turns into a war, history will turn back and look at 2020 as having been a year when the war was already ongoing.
Interesting, interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have thought, unconventional warfare like cyber warfare or, other types of warfare has, as mounting as an official warfare.
I think I just lost you for a second. Could you just repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
Okay, no, interesting. I mean, it's interesting, how people characterize, as you said, like a cold war. Is it a hot war? I'm curious, and as you said, is it overly simplistic, or is there anybody who benefits of it? There's, a lot of the pundits who say, who, keep on mentioning the same terminology until it becomes magic. And there are experts like Kishu Mabubane who say, oh, it's not going to be a war. The rules-based world order is going to, survive. Who benefits from it? Is there an end game? Is there any use to this kind of terminology, or should we just look at an alternative way of looking at the world? Like, is this entirely wrong? The power politics, the geopolitics of it.
I wouldn't want to be too unfair to someone like Kishore Mahbani because he's a legitimate intellectual, right? I will give him that. But in terms of the overall space, you've already answered the question in a sense, right? The only people who benefit from this are the pundits and the academics and what I like to call the intellectual class of many societies who are now increasingly relegated into social media bubbles where they all agree with each other, they all have the same politics, they all have the same takes, they all have the same kind of dismissive attitude against people on the other side of any ideological spectrum. So the only people who I don't see, so for example, characterizing this as a Cold War, as an example, right? It benefits nobody other than people who write articles and do PhDs and teach, and essentially people like me, right? I wouldn't want to call the academic world a cartel or a mafia or things like that, but those of us who've been around it for long enough know that it is pretty much a cartel in terms of ideological freedom and in terms of moving up the sort of career ladder and things. It's an industry. And like any industry, there are certain keywords, there are certain marketing tactics, and there are certain identities that you need to have in order for this to survive. So the overcomplication of very simple geopolitical matters, that is a sign that the strategic studies academic class, so to speak, is a very narrow-minded and corrupt one. If I could be allowed to use strong words.
Interesting, interesting. I was under the impression that we are oversimplifying a somewhat complicated matter, but you are of the wave that we are overcomplicating a more simple geopolitical matter.
Always. Geopolitics is very simple. Geopolitics is one of the simplest things which you can sort of always predict with more or less certainty if you use common sense. What happens is the experts then get on board. And the experts are all experts in their own fields, but they have absolutely no idea how this will come across in other areas. So then you get one person who's an expert in environmental security, who now tells you that the world will sink if you don't listen to him or her. Then you get someone else now on biosecurity, who tell you that we will all now be in the ICU ward dying of COVID if we don't listen to them, right? And you get another expert and another expert. And you soon have a cartel of experts all telling you that you must listen to them simply because they are experts and not because the data and common sense support them, you know?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The world of experts can be a tricky one, and the pressures is too much. So let's turn to a few questions. So we have Damsari Ranasinghe asking, so in terms of Sri Lanka and its policy of neutrality under the new government, how do you think we should tackle the growing, geodynamic, geopolitical different from a different strategy perspective, maybe do you see bring it home to Sri Lanka?
So the diplomatic consensus here has always been that non-alignment is the best policy for us, that neutrality is the best policy for us. I don't really share that opinion, but at the same time, I don't really think non-alignment is that harmful either. My main problem with non-alignment is that it's not done us anything good, right? And typically the people who defend it tend to be people who say, well, it didn't bring us anything that bad. So I personally feel that picking a side would be better. I feel that you look at the Cold War, for example, look at where US allies were and look at where the non-aligned countries were, right? By the time the end of the Cold War rolled around, all the US allies were among the major economies in the world, while all the non-aligned countries were essentially the same as they were, right? All those decades before they became non-aligned. So I'm personally not a big fan of the non-aligned movement, but the general consensus here has always been, and I think will always be, that we need to be non-aligned. So as long as we're consistent with that policy, and as long as we sort of juggle between these different entities, I think we should be good. Ultimately, look, we are reactors. As small countries, we cannot be the ones proactively calling the shots. We are the ones who have to react to whatever the big powers do. So as long as we are flexible in terms of being able to react to the situation, I think that's the best we can hope for at the moment. And maybe in that sense, being neutral or non-aligned, maybe that's a good thing.
Can I also ask one question? Are we really neutral as of right now, which is probably debatable? And you see that one of the biggest champions of the non-aligned movement, India, looks like already picked a side. And is it really practical for us to be non-aligned when our immediate neighbor and big powerful middle power country picks a side? Can we really be non-aligned? And I suppose my third question is it which I asked before, like, is it realistic for us we can say we are non-aligned, but has any of the countries been non-aligned in reality?
I mean, so non-alignment is more of a title than something that can be proven, right? It's like how you might find a lot of people uh, claiming to be good people, right?
Exactly.
But that does not necessarily make you a good person, right? So it's like I always like to say, go through the list of countries in the world, and if that country has democratic in the name of the country, then you can almost bet that that country is not going to be democratic at all, right? If you go through almost all the countries that say Democratic Republic of blah blah blah, Democratic Socialist blah blah blah, none of those 9 out of 10 of those countries are not democracies, right? Are not democratic in any way. So this is something like that, where non-alignment is simply a policy position in terms of geopolitics. No country will ever be completely non-aligned. All countries will pick and choose. However, the significance of being non-aligned in times where the United States and China compete with each other is that, I suppose the thinking is that you could squeeze as much as you can out of both sides. But as I just told you in my previous answer, I am not a big fan of that. So I agree with your reservations that this might not be the best course of action, but we must understand that generations of diplomatic thinking here have been shaped into accepting that non-aligned approaches are the best approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And there's very little that, once again, there's very little that common sense can be, there's very little progress common sense can make in that regard once you deal with generations of thinking.
So let me really put you in the hot seat with this question from the audience, and this is from Lakna, and she's asking, if picking a side is better, as you suggested, what would be the better pick in the current context and why? What is your choice?
So do you mean picking a side in the South Asian power struggle or the Indian Ocean power struggle? The South Asian power struggle would be picking between India and China. The Indian Ocean global power struggle would be picking between the USA and China. So which option do you want?
But I think it's abundantly clear that it's two sides of the same coin: the South Asian struggle and the larger global struggle.
For now, I mean, listen, I mean, as you were saying, what happens if Biden wins? And you have someone like Kamala Harris as the vice president, who's taken a very openly anti-India stance on India-Pakistan relations, on the Kashmir issue, and things like that. I don't see there being much synergy. So I don't think we can just take it for granted that these two will be intertwined.
Okay. So why don't we get, different separate answers from you for both of them, the
Okay,
two
so
views?
India and USA, how about
Yeah.
that? Right? So India, because in terms of cultural synergy, that there's a lot more for us to work there, because if you look at all great partnerships between small powers with junior partners, when there's a lot of cultural synergy, those junior partners tend to benefit very strongly from it, which is why countries with cultural similarities tend to ally with each other. Right? Look at the way South Korean and Japanese society kind of culturally align themselves with what the American demography wants. And there was so much porous sort of cultural transfer of material there that they ended up gaining from it enormously. We don't share a language with China. We share a language with India and the United States. We don't share common entertainment and pop culture sort of perspectives with China, which we do with India and the United States. I mean, look, many Sri Lankans here, they would claim that they despise India, but if you go to any of their weddings in five-star hotels and all that, they're all dancing to Bollywood songs, and their weddings look like a clone of Indian rich weddings in Bombay or North Delhi, right? So in terms of culture, that is what I always look at for long-term projections on who our ally can be and who our rivals are. I understand that China has a lot more to give in terms of a blank check. And I understand that politically here, there are many people who are suspicious of the United States and India. However, if we were being objective, if we had to pick between USA and India and China, I don't see how culturally we end up having more synergy with China. If anything, we will end up becoming a Chinese colony. Whereas if we side with the United States or India, we would become like, we are much more likely to become like Japan or South Korea or Israel or Singapore or any of those countries.
Would you have the same stance if President Trump continues on for 4 more years, because he's been saying different things in terms of Japan and the NATO allies?
Not really, because in terms of the Quad arrangement and in terms of what we're speaking of right now, which is the sort of geopolitical China-USA or China-India rivalry, I mean, if anything, Trump is the only person in Washington who seems interested in moving it in the right direction, right? So, I mean, the first president in a long time who has not pulled his country into a huge military venture in terms of interventions and things like that. So while the American news cycle funded by, I don't know, Silicon Valley, whatever you want to call it, while they might be very heavily invested in pushing a certain narrative about Trump, I think in the relevant geopolitical countries, Australia, India, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Japan, right? These are the real geopolitically significant countries. I think they understand him well enough, and I think his visits there pretty much prove that he's very popular there, regardless of what the news cycle might dictate we think about.
That's true. Interesting. So let's move on to another question. This is from Dileep, and he's asking, do you see any geopolitical ramifications of the rekindled South China Sea dispute, with regard to Sri Lanka? Is there any connection there? Is there any ramifications that might spill off from what's happening in South China Sea to Sri Lanka?
So not direct ramifications, but indirect ramifications certainly, because the way that China, to use a pun, navigates through this South China Sea political web will determine what China's norms are in dealing with the world in general. So if China starts getting more aggressive in the South China Sea in terms of territorial claims, and if China starts getting away with it, it might not affect us immediately, or it might not affect us because of that specific region, but that will then inform Chinese norms in the future, and that would certainly have sort of consequences for us. If it turns out, if China gets the impression that they can sort of go on this rampage of territorial claims with everybody around them, and that they can get away with it because they call the shots, in the international stage. I mean, whatever you would call the international stage now, China more or less calls the shots. And then you have a separate group of nationalist leaders who are kind of working together by themselves. So yes, there will be indirect ramifications.
Right, and I think there's a follow up question about Chinese president, Chinese premier Xi Jinping's style, in which he tends to be uncharacteristically hawkish for the way China operates in the past. Um, and of course, how do you see Xi Jinping's and the Chinese Communist Party's reaction to Australia and Japan, and Xi Jinping's anti-corruption rhetoric at home? How do you think that might play out in the global stage, and maybe as a response to the Quad, and maybe Mike Pompeo saying um, democracies and anti-corruption and transparency against a more authoritarian stance?
So, I mean, from what we've seen so far, they hate it. We don't have to guess how they feel about it. They've already told us many times how they've told the world many times how they feel about it. They hate it. They hate the idea that all these countries are now lumping up together against what they see as trying to stop China's inevitable march to greatness. The thing with Xi Jinping is, look, right now there is a lot of hype around the BRI, what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure your audience would be familiar with as well, right? Now, for now, it's being taken for granted that this will be some kind of monumental success, right? Right now, everybody's worried about the debt trap in China, right? China going to different countries, giving them money, and then China ultimately taking over these countries and all that. I think the way it's going to play out is probably the opposite, as in China will soon find itself in 10 or 15 years, maybe even sooner than that, in a position where they have now thrown money all around the world, hoping it would give them some kind of geopolitical significance, and it's gotten them nowhere. Look at what how the BRI is going with Pakistan, the OPEC, not OPEC, CPEC, right? The China-Pakistan economic, that's in shambles, right? Look at the BRI in Central Asia and all these Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all those countries in complete shambles, right? In some ways, China has fallen into the same trap that the United States fell into in Iraq and Afghanistan. They went into these countries thinking those people would then work with them to create a prosperous vision. And they go in there and find out that those locals, they don't care, right? So, and Xi Jinping has now invested so much into this. This is his dream project, right? This is the project that will define his leadership. This is the project that will define his legacy. If this turns out to be a disaster, he's over. And the next usurper will use just like how they look at Mao's revolutions as a failure now, it's very likely that 10, 20 years from now, the BRI and Xi Jinping's policies will be seen as a major failure, right? I don't see how they bridge that gap. When I see how it's going on in different parts of the world, the thing's a complete disaster, right? The entire Chinese outreach program, which so many are worried about now, if you actually look at the data, is a total disaster. China's getting nothing out of it. And when one of these countries finally says, I'm sorry, we can't pay you, what's China going to do? Invade? That would then signal to the other countries that they can't do business with China anymore. So the minute someone calls China's bluff, that the debt trap is for China, not for the person who owes China money. I think that's how it's going to play out.
Interesting. Okay, so I know we've said 45 minutes. I think we've gone a little bit past. Let's try and end with maybe this final question. I know you partly answered this before. How has the pandemic, or the coronavirus global pandemic, has it affected global geopolitics? Has it intensified? Has it changed anything at all?
So what it's essentially done is, it's number one, it's accelerated this process of many of these, as I was saying, geopolitically significant countries lumping up together to hold China accountable. It certainly fueled that. It's also, I would say, fueled a counter movement that has cultural implications as well, because it's now turned into almost a cultural thing, right? Are you someone in favor of lockdowns and masks, or are you someone who's not in favor of it? So the lines now in many parts of the world are no longer simply objective and factual. It's become political and ideological as well, right? Are you someone who feels that the threat of COVID is exaggerated, or are you someone who feels that the threat of COVID is legitimate and the world needs to lock down and things like that? So many of these lines are now being drawn on sort of based on things that go well beyond facts. And once again, I mean, I don't want to bash on the experts, but this is where the experts have really failed us, right? Whether it's environmental security with climate change, or whether it's biological security with this, the experts are so smug and arrogant, and they talk down to regular people, and they tell them, listen, we're not going to share the data with you, we will not clear your worries. If you have common sense worries, we will shame you for questioning us, because we are the experts, god damn it, and you're a nobody, right? Which is why climate change should be a very easy argument to make, but the experts, if anything, have made it a very difficult thing to believe, with their own apocalyptic predictions and smugness, and unwilling to engage with anybody who's skeptical. It's the same with the pandemic. It should have been very easy to convince everybody that we need to take this seriously and we need to take certain measures to be careful. But because of the sneering, the shaming of anybody who tried to point out that livelihoods are important as well, right? The constant, oh, you need to listen to the experts. Haha, look at these idiots who don't want to listen to these experts. It's become a major calamity now. So it will change geopolitics in that way, along cultural lines. But as I said in the beginning, in terms of the big picture calculations, I don't see anything going in the opposite direction. Things that were going in a certain direction might go a little faster. That's about it.
Okay. Anyway, I think that's a good ending to our very brief discussion today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience, and especially Nilan, for joining with us with very short notice. I know this is like a very timely topic, and we had to
Are you being
Nilan
sarcastic when you say short answers? No?
short notice.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't give you a lot of time to for this. And Nilan, do you want to say if anyone in the audience wants to reach out to you, if they want to follow you, do you want to say something, or like do you have a Twitter or something?
I mean, I'm not really on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, to be honest. I am on Facebook, but I don't really post much there, right? Just the
Mhm.
usual Facebook stuff of pictures and stuff like that. Once in a while, an angry maybe update or something like that, but I'm not too active. I mean, if you Google my name, I'm sure you will get some of the articles that I've written. I've written on many different things, from military technology to the history of counter-terrorism to ancient spies, and written about a lot of stuff. So other than not really, I mean, I'm not a sort of public
Mhm.
intellectual, if that's what
Mhm.
you're worried
I know. Yes, yes. I've seen a good article about the invisibility clock and the technologies that you've written.
about. For John, yeah, that's right. For Columbia University, yeah, I wrote that a
Um,
couple of times.
Yes, if anybody wants to follow Nilan, look up his name. There's a lot of good information there. Anyway, thank you so much, Nilan, for taking the time. This has been a very lively discussion. And as I said in the beginning, what makes you attractive is that you are a straight shooter, and no BS, and which is a very attractive quality in like an academic, which is somewhat very rare. Anyway,
I hope your audience agrees with that as well. Let's see. Thank you for having me.
yes, and hopefully we'd love to have you again, for continued discussions in the future. And thank you for the audience to joining in, and thank you for everybody who raised questions and the comments. Uh, until next time, and thank you, Nilan.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Take care.